Thank you. I'm coming from a very different perspective, and I was asked to basically talk about UK-India collaborations from a researcher perspective, especially researchers that actually haven't worked in India before. And we've been working with IIT Delhi probably for about 20 years, and that 20-year period actually matters because we've developed very strong and deep personal relationships that's made it possible for us to do some things that are, I think, quite special. But we've also had growing pains. So the purpose of this is really to talk about the history of the relationship, how it's evolved and why it's evolved. We're going to talk about a few successes, a few challenges, and then some suggestions, as I say, from a researcher perspective, rather than maybe partly programmatic and also probably related to what people are actually doing. Just to remind you, I'm an engineer. We had that thing yesterday. There are a few other engineers here, but I'm probably the only water engineer here, and that's the perspective that I'm coming from. So we're really interested in environmental exposures and the role of environmental exposures on the health consequences in medical and veterinary systems. Our relationship has been a long one, but the key event relative to the relationship was in 2008, and that was when we wrote what was called a transformation technology grant with EPSRC. And what the only requirement of the grant was to come up with something that would transform the technological capacity of the group we were working with in Delhi. And it was decided that what they needed to be able to do future work in environmental biology was a molecular biological lab. So over a couple of years, we jointly, through a combination of buying things and teaching things and working together, had a functional lab within about 3 years in molecular microbiology. What that did was create a series of personal relationships which led into a series of personal exchanges, the most important of which was when Zia Hamid, who is now an associate professor at IITD, came to Newcastle and worked as a postdoc for me for 3 years. Now, this happened to be related to bioenergy. It was nothing to do with AMR, but when Zia was working in my lab, he saw all the work we were doing in Latin America, particularly in Cuba, looking at the relationship between industrial pollution and AMR, and he thought that it would be a great idea to try and start doing similar sorts of things in India. Well, I thought I'd never worked in India before, and except for related to the workshop, to the lab work, and but I only wanted to do it if we were going to do something of interest and of value relative to understanding things in a bigger picture. And so that led into the work that we did on the Ganges, which I'll talk about in a moment. But it then led to a whole series of other things. PhD students, when he went back to India and became an assistant professor, we had PhDs, postdocs going backwards and forwards with long-term residential involvement. So people were getting to know each other very well on a personal level. And also, there was a transformation of where the funding of the work was. Initially, it was primarily come from the UK. As time proceeded, the money was primarily coming from Indian sources. And in fact, that was great for Zia. It wasn't actually very good for us. And it wasn't because we resented Zia's success. It was because Zia was becoming very, very good and very attractive to other places of the world. And over about a 2-year period, he had about $5 million worth of investment from other countries to work in the molecular lab that we had developed. And we couldn't really sustain our involvement except on the personal level because we weren't getting the associated support on the UK side to allow us to still be there. Now, despite the fact that we didn't really have a lot of money, especially at the beginning, I think some of the stuff we did was kind of important in different sorts of ways. I mentioned earlier the Ganges study. We were interested in the Ganges not for sensational reasons, but because we were trying to understand the root causes of the movement of resistance from one place to another, possibly through environmental sources. And one of the things that was unique about the Ganges, it's a place where there's very little background pollution per se. It's really a place where humans are moving around, and by following humans from different places, we could look at how the resistance was moving around the environment. And as it turned out, it had quite a lot of influence, especially at higher levels within policy, at least immediately after the work was done. We've subsequently done a lot of work trying to map the levels of resistance in different places, particularly we're doing this around the world, but I'll only show the Delhi work, particularly related to the exposures of carbapenem-resistant phenotypes and genotypes in the environments in New Delhi. That map on the right is a picture of the summer and the winter, and the circles represent the abundances of CRE in the surface waters in the city. So this is a quantitative version of what Tim Walsh did a number of years beforehand. But what's really important here is I think it shows the importance of the engineering side to try and understand exposures. What this basically tells us is where in the city you are more likely going to be exposed to resistance. Now, we actually can't say the health consequence of that because we haven't actually worked with the health people. We've tried, but basically we haven't had as much cooperation as we would like. Now, that's a bad news thing, but there's a very good news thing that's happened over the last couple of months, and it was that we got one of the GCRF Global Hub projects in water security and sustainable development. This project is about water security. It includes IIT Delhi, a university in Malaysia, a university in Ethiopia, Columbia, Newcastle University, Oxford, and Leeds. But I think part of the reason why we got this was because of the nature of the relationships that we developed between us and IIT Delhi, because they're among the stronger partners of our research team. What's valuable here is we've got 17 million pounds, almost half of which is going into social science. So one of the things that we've learned as we've worked more and more in countries with less developed sanitation systems is the social interventions become much, much more important. And so one of my goals within this project, and I'm the AMR lead on the water side of the whole project, is to try and use this as a way of drawing in social science, which becomes critically important. And basically, if you look at the cost benefits of interventions, technical or social, when you're less developed, social is more important. When you're more developed, technical is more important. And in fact, what you want to do is move across that spectrum. And so we want to understand the economic benefits of small changes, small social changes, small technical changes. And that's what this particular study is intended to do. Finally, I want to just say things from a very personal perspective about challenges and my suggested solutions. Now, from hearing other people speak, some of the things that I'm going to complain about, suggest, are things that other people have already resolved. But I'm a sort of a beginner in this. I don't have the network of people, say, within the medical world. I'm in a fairly small world trying to break into the market. So, thinking about the challenges to do with politics are always tricky. And this is true in every country, but within UK-India relationships, they're particularly tricky. Intra-country relationships, bilateral relationships, everything has got a political touch to it. And you've got to wade carefully through the politics because you really, this mutual benefit, which one of the other speakers mentioned, is something that's got to be borne in mind. My suggestion is, I think anybody who gets a penny to work in India, or vice versa, needs to attend workshops, trainings, whatever, to become more aware of the nature of the relationships they're going to be dealing with, both within countries and between countries. Communications and distance. That's true anywhere where you're trying to work on the other side of the world, and it's true for our Indian colleagues as well as us. What we've addressed that by is having bilateral residential requirements on projects. So if somebody's working on my project that's related to India, they're going to spend at least 3 to 6 months in Delhi. That's a requirement. So that gives them a contextual feel for what they're doing and not feel like they're just airlifting in or airlifting out. The same thing is true with Indian colleagues. We've had 6 people go backwards and forwards over the last few years. And this is a complaint I have, challenge, is that from my world, I see there's inadequate local support for newcomers. There's people who've established collaborations, but if you go in to work in India and you've got some funds to do some work, or vice versa, you don't really have a basis from which you can work. And I like the BERI program from the British Academy. I don't know whether people know what the BERI program is, but there's these residential schools that are in different targeted locations. I think that's a really good idea. And in fact, that's what a lot of other countries are doing in India. They're placing government-mandated institutional working hubs in India to allow those types of relations, especially for people who don't have connections. And finally, and this is probably the biggest challenge we have right now, is the intense and growing external competition. IT Delhi has become really quite good. Not quite good, very, very good. And the rest of the world knows that. This is an environmental AMR. They've been given $5 million just in a targeted, directed way with specific relationships developed by one by a group in the Netherlands and one by a group in Germany. There was no competition, it was just allocated. And this has happened in the last 3 years, and that's really influenced our relationship. UK hasn't really done anything like that. For us to compete and be involved in this interaction, we have to go out and try and compete for the money. We can't even come close to the amount they've got. Now, obviously, by getting this GRF thing, we've sort of circumnavigated the problem, but the problem still exists. Finally, and this is the thing I put in after yesterday's conversations, engineers are important. We study the environment in a different way, and we're quite a bit more holistic in terms of what we do. Now, I do recognize, somebody made a comment yesterday, and I completely agree with it, is there's not enough engineers who understand AMR. AMR is hard. It requires mass transfer, physics, chemistry, genetics, all these sorts of things, and engineers aren't trained that way. So I think what we've got to do is try and improve the training, but also improve the awareness of engineering in the other sectors, because we can do some things that other people are not really trained to do. So if anybody wants to talk about specifics related to what we're doing, I can talk to them this afternoon. Thank you.